The Author. Chapter 1. Jonathan Blake was not always the man who trembled at the sight of his own shadow. Once a confident and celebrated horror novelist, he had climbed to the summit of literary fame with his best-selling book, Shadows in the Dark. Critics hailed him as the next Stephen King, a master of terror who could weave nightmares from ink and paper. But success had a dark side. The pressure to meet the expectations of his readers and publisher mounted, demanding more of his mind and soul than he had ever anticipated. As deadlines loomed and the demand for another bestseller grew relentless, Jonathan's life began to unravel. Amid this chaos, his greatest treasure, his 5-year-old daughter, Tina, vanished. One fateful afternoon, as Jonathan buried himself in his manuscript, chasing the shadows of his own imagination, Tina had played unattended in the backyard. He remembered the sound of her laughter echoing through the open window, a background melody to his feverish typing. Then there was silence. When he finally tore himself away from his work, Tina was gone. Panic consumed him. The police were called. Searches were conducted, but she had disappeared without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and hope withered into despair. Jonathan was left with the cavernous void in his heart, filled only with guilt and self-loathing. To cope with his overwhelming guilt, Jonathan turned to the only solace he knew: writing. But his words were no longer just a means of escape. They became a vessel for his torment, a reflection of his deteriorating mind. He wrote feverishly, pouring his anguish and desperation onto the pages. The lines between reality and fiction blurred, and his once vivid imagination became a haunting abyss. Chapter 2. In the midst of his mourning, a new presence entered Jonathan's life. Stephanie Williams was young, just 25, with an infectious enthusiasm for literature. She had recently joined the publishing house and was assigned as Jonathan's new editor. With her bright eyes and eager smile, she seemed an unlikely companion for his descent into darkness. "Mr. Blake, it's an honor to work with you," Stephanie said during their first meeting. Her voice was warm, a stark contrast to the cold emptiness that had settled in Jonathan's heart. "Just call me Jonathan," he replied, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "And thank you. I hope you're ready for this." Stephanie nodded earnestly. "I've read Shadows in the Dark multiple times. I can't wait to see what you're working on next." Jonathan managed a weak smile. "Be careful what you wish for." Their collaboration began smoothly enough. Stephanie was diligent and perceptive, providing insightful feedback and encouragement. Yet, as Jonathan's writing grew darker, so did their interactions. He often warned her, half-jokingly, that his new manuscript was more terrifying than anything he had written before. "You should be careful, Stephanie," he said one day, handing her the latest pages. "My work has a way of getting under your skin." Stephanie laughed lightly, brushing off his comment. "I can handle it, Jonathan. I'm here to make sure it's the best it can be." But as she read through the manuscript, she found herself increasingly disturbed by the content. The story followed a grieving father whose desperation to find his missing daughter led him to make a pact with a demonic entity. The writing was visceral, the horror palpable, and Stephanie couldn't shake the feeling that the line between fiction and reality was becoming perilously thin. Chapter 3. With each chapter she edited, Stephanie began to experience strange and terrifying events. At first, it was subtle, a sense of being watched, fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision. But soon, the manifestations became more pronounced. She heard whispers echoing in her apartment, felt cold hands brushing against her skin at night. One evening, as she read a particularly harrowing passage, the temperature in her room plummeted. The words on the page seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. The father stood before the mirror, chanting the ancient incantation. The air grew thick with the scent of brimstone, and the shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, promising what his heart desired most. As Stephanie read, her breath fogged in the sudden chill. The shadows in her room elongated, creeping towards her. She slammed the manuscript shut, heart pounding, and the room instantly returned to normal. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, the power of Jonathan's prose playing tricks on her mind. But deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. Chapter 4. Jonathan's own experiences were no less disturbing. The manuscript seemed to take on a life of its own, guiding his hand to write scenes that haunted his dreams. He was plagued by visions of Tina, lost and crying out to him from a dark void. His desperation grew, and he began to feel an invisible presence in his home, whispering promises of his daughter's return. One night, driven to the brink of madness, Jonathan decided to confront the entity he had unknowingly invoked. He sat at his desk, the manuscript before him, and spoke into the silence. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The room grew cold, and the shadows coalesced into a figure, its eyes burning with an unholy light. "I can give you what you desire," it hissed. "Your daughter returned to you. But there is a price." Jonathan's heart raced. "What price?" "A soul for a soul. Your editor, Stephanie, she must be traded for your daughter." Horror and disbelief warred within him. "I can't do that," he whispered. "She's innocent." The figure's eyes glinted with malevolent glee. "The choice is yours, Jonathan. Your daughter's life for hers, or continue to live in this torment, forever bereft." The figure dissolved into the shadows, leaving Jonathan alone with his despair. The decision tore at his conscience, but the longing for his daughter was overpowering. He rationalized that Stephanie was young, resilient. She could survive whatever fate awaited her. Tina was just a child, his child. Chapter 5. With a heavy heart, Jonathan returned to his writing, knowing what he must do. The next chapters flowed from his keyboard with an otherworldly ease, the story darkening further as it neared its climax. Each word was a step closer to the unthinkable, a bargain sealed with keystrokes and blood. Stephanie, unaware of the true nature of the manuscript, continued her work. The terror she felt while reading was overshadowed by her admiration for Jonathan's talent. She praised him, saying it was his best work yet, though it left her feeling increasingly vulnerable and afraid. As she neared the final pages, the manifestations intensified. Her nights were filled with nightmares of demonic figures and infernal landscapes. During the day, she saw glimpses of grotesque faces in mirrors and windows, and heard disembodied voices calling her name. Despite her fear, she was compelled to finish the manuscript. The story's grip on her was unrelenting, a dark siren song that she couldn't ignore. Chapter 6. On the night Stephanie finished reading the manuscript, the air in Jonathan's house grew thick with anticipation. He sat in his study, waiting, the final chapter clutched in his hands. As the clock struck midnight, the shadows in the room deepened and the figure reappeared. "It is done," it intoned. "The trade has been made." A cold dread settled over Jonathan. "What do you mean?" The figure's lips twisted into a sinister smile. "Stephanie has read the final words. The contract is complete. Your daughter will be returned to you." "No!" Jonathan screamed, the reality of his actions crashing down on him. "I didn't want this. I didn't want her to suffer." But it was too late. The figure vanished, leaving Jonathan to his guilt and regret. Moments later, he heard a soft, familiar voice. "Daddy?" Tears filled his eyes as he turned to see Tina standing in the doorway, her small frame illuminated by the dim light of the study. He rushed to her, gathering her into his arms, sobbing with relief and sorrow. "Thank you," he whispered, though his heart was heavy with the knowledge of the price he had paid. Chapter 7. Stephanie was never seen again. Her disappearance was a mystery that baffled the police and haunted Jonathan's conscience. He told himself it was worth it, that Tina's return justified the sacrifice. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had damned an innocent soul for his own selfish desire. Tina, though physically unharmed, was changed. She spoke little of her time away, and there was a darkness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Jonathan tried to protect her, to keep her safe from the shadows that lingered in their home. But he couldn't escape the feeling that he had brought something malevolent into their lives, something that watched and waited in the darkness. As he resumed his writing, he found himself unable to recapture the brilliance of his previous work. The words felt hollow, the stories lifeless. His success waned, and he became a recluse, haunted by his past and the choices he had made. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the shadows whispered, Jonathan would think of Stephanie. He wondered where she was, what fate had befallen her. And he knew that no matter how many books he wrote, no matter how many accolades he received, he could never wash away the stain of her sacrifice. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you liked this video, please support it and this channel by giving this video a thumbs up. Also, please hit that subscribe button, and remember, enjoy the journey. See you next time.